Hey, everybody, welcome to this episode of Compassion and Courage Conversations in Healthcare. I'm your host, Marcus Engel, and with me, as always, is the hostess with the mostest, which is the hotness, aka Marvelyne, aka my wife. Hi, babe.
Hi, it's good to see you.
Welcome. Yeah, you too, even through a computer screen. So, this is the podcast where we teach compassionate communication, provide perspective, and inspire resilience. We're going to touch on all three of those aspects today because we're continuing our journey, our discussion about secondary trauma. And Marvelyne and I, we know this from evidence, but we also know it from personal experience with friends and relatives who work in the healthcare field, just how much it can play on one's emotions and one's psyche to consistently be taking care of people who are suffering or people who have suffered. That's what we call secondary trauma, right? When the caregiver feels that. But as always, it feels like a good place to start with this discussion of secondary trauma or vicarious trauma would be with a disclaimer that neither myself nor Marvelyne is a psychologist. So this is not by any means medical advice. We just wanted to give you some general topics, some general ideas about how to handle secondary trauma when it may come along in your life or in your practice. So, shall we start with the definition, my dear?
That's great. And you actually did a really good one. It's the psychological trauma of being exposed to other people's traumas, especially on a continuing basis. And that's something almost everyone in healthcare experiences regularly, but a lot of us do anyway at different times throughout our life. I know I have, I know you have, and we're not even in a field
We're
that
not
attracts
clinical.
it. Right.
Right. Right. I have never had the boy, I was reflecting on this week, this past week, actually, we had the opportunity to work with some doctors, and one of them, he won an award. And as he was being presented his award, they were telling stories about his work through the COVID pandemic. And again, this is an ER doc working through COVID, and they talked about the spacesuit and how difficult it was to try to connect with patients when you are physically separated from them by a barrier. And I think we often have kind of long-term memory loss. We forget just how traumatic that year or two was. Now, if you worked the front lines during that, maybe you haven't forgotten, but I think as time fades and memory fades a little bit, we need to really take the time to acknowledge and respect that we all went through something, right? We all went through something with the pandemic, but those of you who are at the bedside in healthcare, you really, really went through it. And I would imagine that you would say, like practically every healthcare professional I've talked to, that you don't leave something like a global pandemic without a little bit of residue on you, right? We don't get through it completely unscathed. So we thought today we'd like to share a couple of points about how to get through this thing called secondary trauma. How do we keep on keeping on when we know that we might be feeling burnt out or compassion fatigue because of the repeated caretaking of people who have been traumatized? So, where do we want to start with that today? We've got a couple of points.
We do. And the truth is a global pandemic, a global pandemic is obviously incredibly stressful for everyone. And we've got the scientific proof and the journals that are coming out, journal articles all the time about that. But it also happens on a one-on-one basis when you're taking care of an elderly parent or someone or a child with medical needs. We all, at different points in our life, are exposed to another person's trauma. And if we have any kind of empathy and compassion, then that is going to affect us. So, one of the first ways we know, everybody knows you can't care for someone else without caring for yourself. Okay, absolutely true. Harder to do, right? It's harder to do than to say. So, the first thing that's important is preventing and treating this secondary trauma, to prevent and treat secondary trauma. And we can't do that unless we are paying attention to our bodies, because that is what stores emotion. It's also where we get the information about the stress and the feelings that we are experiencing. So, learning to pay attention to our bodies is the very first thing that we have to do. And what does it mean to pay attention to your body? Well, it means to slow down, which is hard, and obviously pay attention. And maybe right now, if you just stop for a second and think about what kind of stresses am I facing, primary or secondary, and where do I feel stress in my body? What part of my body carries that stress? Um, Knowing and quickly recognizing, look, I am really overstressed in this area, instead of just, being the Energizer bunny and pushing on through, which we all know we have to do, but recognizing I'm paying for it with my back hurts, or I'm paying for it with whatever your body does, can tell you, hey, it's time to either take a break, or it's time to recognize this is just something that is too much to bear alone. I need some help in getting through this. So paying attention and recognizing it in yourself.
I think many people, and I think especially healthcare workers, kind of have that tendency to push through, right? To push through. I've heard nurses brag about how long they can go without peeing. We know that it's almost a little bit of a badge of honor when people work two double shifts, or a double shift. We know that back in the day, it used to be a medal of honor for residents to have to work 80 hours a week. Thank goodness we've learned the safety precautions so that these things don't happen anymore. But we do have to slow down. Whenever we talked about preventing and treating secondary trauma, prevention, that's a little harder. That's a little harder. But it starts with recognizing when it has happened to you. And how do we do that? Unfortunately, sometimes we don't recognize it until we've got a true medical issue, because we haven't been paying attention. We've been pushing on through, trying to just keep going to work, trying to get the grind, trying to make sure the kids are fed and clothed and educated. And ultimately, sometimes then that shows up as a medical difficulty, etc. Pay attention. Start noticing things early. And how do we do that? Everybody knows my keynote, everybody knows the experiences that I had at the other end of the stethoscope and the compassionate communication that I try to instill. But what I think a lot of people don't realize is that I also have a whole lot of education, knowledge, and maybe even a little bit of wisdom in this world of mindfulness and meditation. And that's after practicing now for several years. When we can sit still, what I teach in my presence workshops is that when we can sit still and take a few breaths, then just start to notice our body. Don't move your body, just sit still. And then just start to notice, where is it in your body that right now you feel stress? And maybe you don't even know what stress feels like. Maybe you feel pain. Maybe you feel something, soreness, right? If it's from an injury, we obviously know that happens. But so often, I think we are clamped up in our bodies when we're under stress too consistently. And we've got to take the time to stop, recognize where do we feel tension in our body, and then maybe take just a few deep breaths at that moment and try to breathe into that tension. I know with myself, I feel a lot of tension in my face. I feel a lot in my jaw. This kind of makes sense with all the facial trauma that I've had. I also feel it in my hips and my back. Now, right now, some of you all are probably saying, yeah, Marcus, that's because you're pushing 50. You're going to feel it everywhere. And maybe part of that is true. Maybe part of that is true. But we do have to slow down to be able to pay attention to even recognize what's going on internally. And how do we slow down? It becomes a pattern, it's a habit. Once we do it, it's not so hard to do it the next time. And then it's not so hard to do it the next time. And then it's not so hard to do it the next time. So if you can work in various ways to come back to center several times during the day, hopefully that keeps us a lot more grounded in paying attention to what's going on inside our heads, inside our hearts, inside our bodies.
I love that, and I know one of the things you use for an example in your presentation on this is you talk about perhaps when you leave work that even just touching the roof of the car as you get in, putting your hands on the steering wheel, cranking some tunes, or putting on the calm app, maybe something
Mhm.
where you go, okay, I left that. I'm entering this space now and I'm breathing through, you know, what was there, not ignoring it, not putting it in a box away, but recognizing I'm entering a different space now. And I find that so powerful. I try to use that all the time. And you know that because you live with me and my random dance parties. Topic for another day. Okay. So if we notice when and pay attention to when we're feeling the stress and the trauma, we also have to really start noticing what does self-care feel like. Now, I know if we've been on a couple of super long flights back to back or something, physically exertion-y, the things I try to avoid, um, we will sometimes get a massage. And I know that when I lay on the table, I don't put on music, I don't put on a podcast, and I ask the uh, therapist there not to talk. And I ask them to be quiet. And then I just sit there and I intentionally breathe the whole time. And I say to myself, I am breathing in wholeness and wellness. I am breathing out stress. And I just say it over and over. Now, my brain won't cooperate with that. My brain runs away, and I have to, because I total squirrel brain, I have to pull it back. But I do pull it back then and go, these 45 minutes that I get to be here, I am breathing in hellness sometimes. I
Illness?
am breathing in wholeness and health and wellness. And I just keep letting my brain say it over and over because that is a moment that I get to myself and I get to really pay attention to what I am breathing, what I am experiencing, and having that moment of presence in my life. So we have to learn, what does self-care feel like. For me, that's one of the things it feels like. Now, I'd love to tell you that binging Netflix is also self-care, and it may be for a minute, but distraction is not self-care. And it's really important that we define the two of those and notice what self-care is. Now, indulging in our, favorite Netflix binge or Ben and Jerry's or our favorite beverages, um, that does not mean most people can do that fine and it not be problematic, but it does not necessarily mean self-care. It may not actually be helping to heal you, right? It may just be distracting you and leaving the trauma sitting there waiting to rear its ugly head.
Distraction is something that we use to cope, but it's not necessarily a proactive move towards wholeness and health. Um, I when it's really hard sometimes to be in the present moment, right? Because we have so many different distractions constantly being bombarded. My phone has I've gotten at least 4 text messages in the time we've been talking here. Right, that's a quick distraction. I want to be part of this conversation, but of course I'm a little iffy on if the technology is going to work. Right, we live in Florida where a summer storm could knock out our internet in a heartbeat. These are things that get in the way of us being present. They get in the way of us being present. When we are present, that's when we can heal. That's when we begin to heal. When we're not living in the future or living in the past, and we know we can't live in the future or the past physically. So what do? We fill the future up with anxiety or worry about what's going to happen, and then other times we spend time worrying about what has already happened in the past. And so those two places don't help us find happiness. And gurus and philosophers for thousands of years have told us happiness can only be found in the present moment. In the present moment. When you are in a present moment and you are completely embodied in being right here, right now, in this moment, that's when we start to heal. That's when we're truly taking care of ourselves.
When you said that, it just reminded me by nature, I'm such a renumerator, which just means I relive bad moments. And sometimes those bad moments are stupid. If I told you, you would laugh. Yet I will wake up at 3 a.m. in a cold sweat going, oh, I shouldn't have said that stupid thing in high school, X number of years ago. So understanding you don't have to consistently relive things, stopping yourself from doing it, taking a cold glass of water or doing something. If you're like me, some of the healthiest people I know can barely remember yesterday because they're choosing not to look back at a mistake. They forgive themselves quickly and they move on if they've made a mistake, because mistakes can be one of the things that are traumatizing. And the truth is, we can't really minimize and make trauma go away. We just can't. If you are breathing, you are, or you are going to, or you have, and sometimes again, it's all of them at once, experience and deal with trauma, especially if you're in healthcare, because you're watching people at some of their worst, most vulnerable moments consistently. But there is a little trick that we can do, and I'm going to put you on the spot here, Marcus, because this is something I know from living with you. You have always been the type of person that if you learn a good thing, you take it and run. And I'm thinking about what I learned when I was helping you edit your first book after this, that if the doctor came in right after your crash, you were in so much pain, how you lived through it, honestly, I still don't really fully understand. But if physical therapy came in and said, take 10 steps, you were going to take 15. I mean, you just made that determination and you still live that way. If you find out it's good for you, you just go all out. Back in your hospitalization days, in those first initial days, what was it that helped you take those extra steps, live through that pain, make those choices? What was it that helped you do that?
Well, once I knew I wasn't going to die, it became the idea of, well, if you're going to live, live, right? Actually live, have a life. And how am I going to get a life? How am I going to get life back? How am I going to recapture life? Well, by doing the things that I have to do to put myself back into the place that I just came from, right? So my goal was always to get back into college. And having that goal, being able, I didn't know how I was going to get there. I didn't know what it was going to look like once I got there, but being able to imagine myself back at college, even being blind, um, being back with my friends again. That's what I wanted, and I just had to understand that I can get there. I don't know how I'm going to get there, but I can get there. And if I first thing I have to do is just listen to my doctors. I've got to listen to my healthcare professionals around me. And if 10 steps is good, 15 is probably better. I wanted to get out of that hospital. I was highly motivated to get out of that hospital and get back on with life, but I just didn't know how that was going to work. But I knew that I had to physically heal up before I could navigate what it was going to mean to be blind in this new world.
I am going to put that in one phrase. I'm going to sum it up into one sentence, which is seeing yourself on the other side of this experience. Seeing yourself on the other side of trauma. And I think that is something that when we are willing to look at it in a bigger picture and go, this is horrible right now. This is unbearable right now. It's not unbearable. You have lived through everything you've experienced. Everyone has to this point. So I try to not use the word unbearable myself, but this is miserable. This is awful. But see yourself on the other side. What is life going to be like? What am I going to be able to accomplish? How am I going to use this? Even if it's saying, looking at a patient that you can't help, knowing I'm going to say, I'm here. I'm going to show up for this patient. I can't fix all their problems, but I can give them the gift of my presence. That's what I can do. I can see myself, see what I'm helping, see who I'm helping, see what I'm accomplishing, and seeing life after this trauma. When we can do that and see after, that goes a long way to helping us be resilient.
Yeah, and I think those who have been traumatized,
Yes,
those of us who have truly been traumatized, and I mean primary trauma, primary trauma, not secondary trauma here. We want to make it worth something. We want to make it good. We
exactly.
want to make sure that everything that we went through wasn't for naught, right? We want to make sure that the experience, the endurance that we had to show to get through that very difficult time is worth something, right? Was it worth it? Gosh, I know for me, I have always looked for the redemption in not only my own story, but in the stories of others. And sometimes redemption simply means, what did I learn from this experience? Can I apply it moving forward in life so that if I was ever in this experience again, I would be able to know what to do better? And second, so nobody else has to experience the kind of pain that I endured, right? I think those of us who have been truly traumatized never want others to have to endure that same kind of pain. That's at least what I think those of us who are traumatized who are doing something healthy with it. And I always wanted to think in that hospital, what's the answer to that question of why? Well, that question of why someday will be answered. And in the meantime, I just have to keep doing what I'm doing, right? I just got to keep going and knowing that that answer is someday going to be revealed to me.
And you have, and you did, and you share that with us all the time. And we need help along the way. It's good to reach out and get help. You're not alone. Don't choose to go through things alone. Because, for example, I'm going to use you again, Marcus. It was a lot of people that stepped up at different times in different spaces and for different seasons to help you, and reaching out to get help when we need it and to carry for ourselves. Again, these move us to healthy resilience and overcoming of trauma, of secondary trauma, and vicarious trauma.
And that's really what we're trying to do, right? We're just trying to help people in any little way that we can, spread a little more compassion in the world, a little more understanding, a little more empathy. And we do have great amounts of both empathy and compassion and respect for those of you who are at the bedside or in the clinics or in the offices of healthcare. Thank you for doing what you do. Thank you for making it worth it to continue to take care of traumatized patients. And we just appreciate you all so much. So thank you everyone for being part of this episode of Compassion and Courage. Again, this is the podcast where we teach compassionate communication, provide perspective, and inspire resilience. We want to thank everyone for your questions, your comments, how you share and boost on social media. We really, really appreciate that. What am I forgetting before we go today, hon?
We do have a big announcement coming up. So,
Ooh, big announcement's going to be coming up in the next week or two, right?
yeah, sooner rather than later. Be sure you're following on social media. We are super excited about this project we've just completed for you.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool thing, and you're going to hear a lot about it in the upcoming weeks. So thank you all for being part of this episode, and we look forward to seeing you at the next episode of Compassion and Courage.